And it's official. Hello and welcome to Welty at Home. We are the slow reading virtual book club. We alternate works by Welty with authors that are connected to Welty in some way. I'm Jessica Russell. I'm the director of the Eudora Welty House and Garden. And today we are kicking off a new series on a book that Eudora Welty loved and for which she also wrote a foreword. To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. I am pleased to introduce Virginia Woolf scholar, Susan Harrison. She is the Eckerd College Professor of Rhetoric and author of Eudora Welty and Virginia Woolf, Gender, Genre, and Influence. Susan will be co-leading discussions with Eudora Welty's friend and our friend, her biographer, Suzanne Mars. Suzanne, of course, is Professor Emerita of Millsaps College as well, quite a scholar, and we couldn't do it without her. Today, we'll be discussing the foreword by Welty and the window sections 1 through 5, pages 3 to 30 in the Harcourt Brace edition. Of course, any edition will do. Just some housekeeping before we officially get kicked off. If you are new, if you want to comment or ask a question, in order to do that, raise your hand using the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a phone or a tablet, you might have to tap to get to that raise hand function. And Suzanne and I will be looking for your name and we'll call on you in the order in which you raised your hand. And also be sure to keep an eye on the chat. There's also a side discussion happening in the chat. It's really lively. And I will say thank you to fellow longtime Welty at Home participant, John Hennigan. I'm going to open up the chat with a couple links and resources from him. There is a PDF of all of the poems mentioned in To the Lighthouse, and there is also a link of the one poem that wasn't in the PDF. So here you go. Here are those goodies. And now, without further ado, I want to turn it over to Susan and Suzanne to officially begin our discussion on To the Lighthouse.
Susan, I'm going to let you officially begin.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. And I can't tell you how exciting it is to be here and to see a number of old friends and also get to enjoy reading with a number of new people that I'm looking forward to hearing from and getting to know over the next few weeks. This is one of my favorite novels, and To the Lighthouse is actually one of the ways that I came to Eudora Welty. And so it's so interesting to read her introduction, because I think that my experience of reading To the Lighthouse the first time was very, very similar to Eudora Welty's. I mean, I just felt like I had entered a world that I just wanted to be in. It was so moving to me, and just really transported me. And then years later, when I read, first of all, Delta Wedding, I felt like I had entered that same world somehow, that somehow or other, that this house filled with family, filled with all of this activity, but really a novel focusing on everything that was going on under the surface of that activity, reminded me immediately of Virginia Woolf. And I gather you all have just finished reading The Optimist's Daughter, which I think is the other Welty novel that is so intimately connected to the Lighthouse, especially in that sense of biography and the relationship between a writer's own personal experience and background and then the fiction that they create. And so I think that it's just so exciting to be able to read this in the context of Eudora Welty. I know that Eudora Welty mentions this in the introduction of her, to the introduction that we read for today. She talks about the biographical impulse that somehow seems to be related to or behind this novel. But of course, she talks about it as not direct, but as I love her phrases, and I just want to make sure I get it exactly right. A bolt of lightning that runs between them. And I love what Woolf said about the role of biography. because the novel is set in a family's vacation home in the Hebrides, and it's clearly modeled on the Stevens family vacation home in St. Ives, Cornwall. And that is where Woolf spent her first 13 summers. She spent in this vacation home in St. Ives. And the last summer, well, the last time they went there was because Virginia Woolf's mother died in 1895. And so that was a kind of an abrupt ending to the time that the family spent in this rather idyllic setting for children running around, getting to run around outside this vacation home on the sea. And so Woolf said about To the Lighthouse, she wrote, "This is going to be fairly short, to have father's character done complete in it, and mother's, and St. Ives, and childhood, and all the usual things I try to put in, life and death, etc." She described it. And so we do get a lot of all those things into The Lighthouse. In an essay, a 1921 essay, Modern Fiction, which she published before the publication of To the Lighthouse in 1927. And in fact, To the Lighthouse was published on the 32nd anniversary of her mother's death. So I think that connection is very, very profound. But in this 1921 essay called Modern Fiction, Woolf writes that she wants to show how an ordinary mind on an ordinary day receives and organizes a myriad of impressions. And of course, To the Lighthouse has two, not complete, but almost complete days captured in it. The one of the window, which takes place in the course of a single day. And then the third section, The Lighthouse, takes place in the course of a single day with all of those myriad impressions running through them. And then the center section, Time Passes, takes place over about 10 years. And I love Welty's description of it. Time gets in, which it certainly does, with a ferocious force in the Time Passes section. So in those days, it's clear that the novel, just even the structure of it, it's clear that this is not a novel that's driven by plot. And that was some of the early criticism of the novel, and quite severe criticism. One of a contemporary of Woolf's, Arnold Bennett, who was really kind of one of her rivals throughout, just in terms of their approaches to fiction, he wrote very scathingly, "A group of people planned to sail in a small boat to a lighthouse. At the end, some of them reached the lighthouse in a small boat. That's the externality of plot." And so, and he was being very critical of this, but he's actually right. That is a kind of a reductive sense of the externality of the plot here. But as Welty says, the novel takes place in the subjective and not in that externality of plot. So I wanted to start out today by just asking what you all found in the Welty introduction that is kind of guiding your entry into the novel, helping you find a way of connecting it connecting to these first few sections that we've read.
Anyone? Hey, Laura.
Hi, everyone. Well, I guess I was I read the introduction. This is my first time reading To the Lighthouse. And then I read the section for today. And then I went back and I was reading because I felt like I needed that. but I think what really struck me was when she talks about love and about how love has 1,000 shapes and how it's something that pervades the novel. That was something that I then went back and thought about the opening sections with that and started thinking about where love came in, where it was mentioned, and how much love there was in so many different ways. And that's something that I'm really looking forward to watching as I keep reading.
Thank you, Laura. We've got Teresa and Pearl and Monica. Teresa?
Good. I just unmuted myself. This is a first for me, like Laura. And what I'm discovering is that this is a very different kind of book to be able to look at people's thoughts rather than their actions. And so I'm trying to pay attention to it. I think this is kind of a hard read. I've read the first section twice now, and it's getting better with each reading.
The mark of a great novel. Pearl?
Yes, I love that Suzanne was pointing out about time itself. And the beginning of that paragraph says, part 1 is thronging with possibilities. All is speculation directed toward the future. It is centered upon destination, promises to the private self, to others. It smiles toward the beckoning of love, which we're talking about. And I didn't underline anything in the introduction because I thought I would have underlined absolutely everything, which would defeat the purpose. But I loved how she prepared us in the sort of depth and slowness of the novel, because the introduction is also that way. And my later thought is, oh, I need to go back and read that introduction, as Teresa just said, or the first person, sorry, Laura. I need to read that introduction after every reading of every section to see how she has so beautifully identified the beautiful qualities of the novel.
Susan, I don't want to preclude you. I'm going to call on Monica, but chime in anytime you want to.
I'm just loving the comments so far, but thank you.
Okay, so Monica and Deborah, and then Beverly and Jessica. And
So
Kathy.
I loved The Lighthouse, and thank you all so much for timing this to coincide with the end of the academic year, so we can just enjoy to The Lighthouse. But I hadn't read Welty's introduction, and a lot of what others are saying resonates, especially first. I mean, Welty's language is gorgeous as Woolf's language in this introduction, not just what she says about love, but if reality is what looms, love is what pervades. And then the next page, she tells us to pay attention to Woolf's verbs, the verbs of sentences, that she herself is doing that. Welty's doing that herself, right? About reality looming and love pervading. So I love that what she's saying about Woolf, she's also doing herself.
I've just been rereading a lot of the essays in the eye of the story, and Reynolds Price said he thought in Eudora Welty, radiance was the word that pervaded that book, and she said yes, and she associated it with love, that the whole concept of love, the love of reading, the love of writing, the concept of love of the characters' experience. Deborah and Beverly?
I read The Lighthouse to The Lighthouse as a very, very young person, and just picked it up again and realized that I understood nothing about it. So I really appreciate this opportunity. I echo what someone just said about wanting to reread the introduction upon every reading that we do throughout the book. What I really took, and I'm grossly paraphrasing here, from the introduction on the first read, is the constant tension of opposites in the writing, the rhythm between this and its opposite, which is something that fascinates me generally. But then reading, it's just astonishing the way that is done. to create this totality of experience. And then you have the constantly shifting points of view of the stream of consciousness from one character to another. The language is so poetic. You could just take lines out and put them on a piece of paper and create astonishing poetry. And the same thing with the introduction. The writing is just that beautiful. So I'm looking forward to this
Thank
and
you, Deborah.
correcting my prior impressions.
I love what you said actually about finding it different this time that you're reading it, because I think that's happened to me every time, but I don't know that I'd ever noticed the humor in it as much. And in any other reading. And, you know, so much of it is Lily Briscoe trying to come to terms with Mr. Ramsey, you know, when she thinks about potatoes and she thinks about the kitchen table. And there's so much more humor in it than I had ever recognized.
Beverly?
What I was struck by when I made myself a note, she was 21 when she read this book. She says she read it not when she wrote the introduction, but when she read it. And she says, I fell upon the novel that once and forever opened the door of imaginative fiction for me and read it cold in all its wonder and magnitude. And I think at 21, I think I did read this around the time I was 21. I was confused a lot of the time during the reading when I read it the first time, so I'm glad to be approaching it again. But when I think about how brilliant Eudora Welty was, and she immediately recognized the brilliance. I thought also in that first section, first page, she says, however great a part recollection played in informing the novel, what connects to the Lighthouse to autobiography seems meteorological in nature, which of course immediately reminded me of Optimist's Daughter, which we have just finished. And that was Welty's most autobiographical work as well. So immediately, even in this forward, I'm beginning to see those connections and why Eudora Welty would have felt so connected to this particular work.
Thanks, Beverly. Jessica?
Well, it's funny. I love all these comments, and what I was going to say is kind of a combination of what Deborah and what Beverly just said. Like Deborah, I was noticing the juxtapositions in the Welty forward, and just reminding myself on this reading to watch for the juxtapositions. I wrote down how shape and order out of chaos and sequence out of, you know, things that are not sequential, and risk, and how she describes it as firm but ethereal. Anyway, so watching for the juxtapositions. And then my comment, I agree, Beverly, I couldn't believe that Eudora Welty could read the novel and then have such a searing guide to it that she could give, that she gave to us. So that's all.
Catherine? We're not hearing you, Catherine. Can you unmute?
Okay, sorry about that. When I read, I sometimes underline, and this was something I had already underlined, and it said, but if there is a pull and lure and threat from the outside world, other threats, other lures are greater, those that search the characters more fatally from within. So.
Yes. The internal. Okay, Joe Ellen. We're missing your sound, Joe Ellen.
I don't think anyone has said anything about the lighthouse much. And Welty starts her essay saying that she picked up the book because of the strong signal of the lighthouse, which is signaling all the time. And I thought while I was reading through the preface, she didn't really mention the lighthouse very much, but certainly by the last paragraph, she begins it saying, to the lighthouse is at once ethereal and firm as perhaps only a vision can be. And I immediately thought of a lighthouse, ethereal and stalwart. And the last sentence, she's saying that it's a bolt of lightning. Virginia Woolf began with an instantaneous burst of coherence over chaos and the dark. She has shown us the shape of the human spirit, which right now I'm seeing as the lighthouse.
You know, there are so many different theories amongst critics about the lighthouse. If you read the criticism, it ends up representing everything from, you know, the masculine energy to the feminine energy associated with the mother. I mean, it's just, you know, it's the object of desire that can never be fulfilled. But I think as we read the novel, it'll be interesting to talk about the lighthouse as it goes on, because I think that trying to reduce that lighthouse to one single thing is like, you know, trying to reduce Mrs. Ramsey to a core wedge of darkness. I think that the multiplicity of the lighthouse and of Mrs. Ramsey and of everyone in the novel is part of the richness. Can I throw out another question? Somebody just mentioned this. In the introduction, Welty writes, I love this whole paragraph. Set down here in the surround of the sea, on the spinning earth, caught up in the mysteries and the thread of time, the characters in their separate ways are absorbed in the wresting of order and sequence out of chaos, of shape out of what shifts and changes or vanishes before their eyes. The act of thinking, the act of using a brush dipped in greens and blues to set down what I see on a square of paper, the giving of human love, of making the moment something permanent, are all responses made at great risk. Risk is the novel's repeated word to the same question, what does it all mean? And as I went back and reread the introduction, started thinking about what risk is in these first sections that we've read for today. What form it takes, who's experiencing it, who's welcoming it, who's afraid of it. I think that thinking of risk throughout the novel is such a wonderful point of entry.
We look at sections 1 through 5. Anyone want to talk about what risks are taken or avoided in these sections? Yeah. Monica?
Well, one of my favorite parts of the whole novel is Lily Briscoe, of course, is the challenge of an artist. And on page 19, it says she could see it all so clearly, so commandingly when she looked. It was when she took her brush in hand that the whole thing changed. So I think one of the risks and maybe even braveries of the novel to me is, the pursuit of art, especially visual art, that one of the things that struck me reading at this time is people, can see what you're doing. It isn't like writing a novel where, you can kind of cover it up. But I think in having a visual artist, it really demonstrates the risk of art.
Eudora Welty, when she sent off a story to John Robinson, a draft of a story, wrote on the top of the paper, all is risk on every line. And then she once told me that she hated putting her stories in the mail. She'd drop them in a mailbox, and then she wanted to stick her hand in and get it back. That's that artistic risk, I think. Yeah. Harriet?
Yeah, I'm thinking about, there's so many different kinds of risk. I mean, there's her writerly risk, of say, putting in the 2 paragraphs of chapter 2, where there is a kind of whiplash, I think, from Mrs. Ramsey feeling so warmly towards Tansley to the rejection of him in chapter 2, but there's also risk in imagery and in ideas. I'm thinking about something. I have to say that I am also reading this almost as if I'm reading it for the first time because I read it so long ago that I don't remember it, and I'm having both a sense of deja vu. I've been there, but I haven't been, and so coming across something like someone had blundered. It took me a while to realize that that was Tennyson, and a reference to the Light Brigade and the idea of a single man being responsible for the deaths of many people. But she just raises this question of somebody had blundered, and we're there as a reader sort of asking who's blundered and why. And we don't need to know in that place at all, because we're busy discovering through the social interaction between Lily and Mr. Banks and Mr. Ramsey. So much is unpacked as we look at that interaction without necessarily following what is being said, and then to the characters. Are the characters following? Does Lily know what that he's quoting poetry? Yeah. So I'm just delighted by the risks that she takes, and I also have a sense of them kind of activating my sense of humor and of Welty's sense of humor, and that there's a kind of delight to the risk that I recognize as Weltian.
Pearl?
Yes, as a mother and a grandmother and being pointed toward risk by Welty, I think the risk is in the very first line. Yes, of course, if it's fine tomorrow, said Mrs. Ramsey, but you'll have to be up with the lark, she added. So the first risk to me is the mother risking this adventure for a very specific time, the morrow. And then she's challenged on that immediately by Mr. Ramsey. And so it sets us off into Mrs. Ramsey's mind and all that she keeps thinking about. Well, she wants to be able to take her son out to the lighthouse. She wants to be able to promise that, but it's a risk. There might be a storm.
Yeah. Laura?
Well, it was that exactly that made me think of risks right away between optimism. Since we just finished reading The Optimist's Daughter, I spent a lot of time thinking about the optimism of Mrs. Ramsey, and as compared and what risk it takes to be optimistic and to be hopeful, and as compared to Mr. Ramsey, who seems to be hopelessly devoted to facts and truth, and he's incapable of an untruth, and that sort of horrible way of always being very sort of literally right, and what that does. And I guess I spend a lot of time thinking about that risk as you know, something that, because it can lead to disappointment, and she sees how disappointed her, James is. She sees that from a mother's point of view as well. So I spent a lot of time thinking about risk in that sense and what it means to be optimistic.
Susan?
I was thinking also about Virginia Woolf's risk, being, the novel is really shot through with her imaginative and artistic risks, that to write a novel that was dismissed by so many people as being, something grounded in a family's vacation, that's what happens in this novel. Nothing happens in this novel. And so thinking about her great risk trying to articulate the subjective, as Welty calls it, and to capture that, and to capture how rapidly it can move even within one character. I mean, Mrs. Ramsey can go from being optimistic to just having some of the darkest thoughts in the novel in the space of one sentence. And so I think that risk is for the characters throughout here. And I think risk and fear of failure is so much part of the novel. But I think also Welty resonated with the artistic risk that she sees Woolf taking in the novel.
Cheryl.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I apologize for being tardy, and I don't know what was discussed pertaining to the essay that Miss Eudora wrote. But one question I like not to be answered right now, but that I had is in her essay, she says that she read it in the book in 1930, only 3 years after it was published. So it's like, how much of Virginia Woolf's life and biography did Welty even know at that time? And when she later wrote the essay that's included in The Eye of the Story, what I was wondering what impressions about Woolf as the writer might have been different, you know, given that she had decades more knowledge about Virginia Woolf's personal biography. So I don't understand the risk thing yet, but I did note that Tansley is described as odious and Ramsay is caustic, and he requires sacrifice as part of his, like, you know, personality. That's it.
Susan, do you want to comment there on?
I'm just laughing at the treatment of Charles Tansley is, I mean, he's so impossible. And yet he's so in love with Mrs. Ramsay. There's that lovely scene where he actually gets to carry her bag and he just feels as though he's transformed. And so I'm sorry, I was just have to admit, I was laughing about Charles Tansley.
I think obviously, of course, Welty knew a lot more about Virginia Woolf when she wrote the foreword than she did in 1930, and she had read biographies, and she had been to see Woolf's house and look at it from the outside to her final home. So yes, and she's read it novel many times since then. So there's a depth of perception she wouldn't have had at age 21, but the depth of perception she did have at age 21 is remarkable. Yeah. We have Margaret and then Rebecca.
I would like to say I read this novel before, but only like 2 years ago. So it also, though, completely, I feel like I was lost in the novel. And this time, I guess because of understanding that this is not linear, and also because I recently read the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas and about all that was going on in the art and literature and so forth. I can see it now in just these little pictures, which is kind of, you know, it doesn't have to make progress, and I like that. And so beautiful, so beautiful.
Thank you. Rebecca.
Yes, coming back to this novel and to Virginia Woolf is like visiting an old lover who you chose not to marry, but you could have. So I was a major Virginia Woolf person before I found Eudora Welty, and then Eudora Welty swept me off my feet, and the, you know, the rest is history. But I have always heard the echoes of Woolf in Welty, thanks to Suzanne's work and the way that Susan's work and the way that it is portrayed. She points out all the connections. I'm also struck by the sentence in Welty's foreword where she writes, "There is nowhere in this radiant novel a shadow of detachment." And that is just, to me, a sentence that I could read over 1,000 times, thinking about what makes a novel radiant and what a shadow of detachment might look like. And I think that, Susan, you're saying that in your, in her commitment to humor, even, there's a commitment to almost every sentence in this book, even to start in the way that she does with Mrs. Ramsey's statement. But then, I mean, I love the way that, so that he, on the second page, so that his mother, watching him guide his scissors neatly around the refrigerator, imagined him all red and ermine on the bench, or directing a stern or momentous enterprise in some crisis of public affairs. And Pearl, when you were talking about, being a grandmother and having been a mother, and these moments where you commit to an idea or an image with so little detachment, and that is what mothering and parenting is. So I just really love that sentence by Welty.
And I love it that that Mrs. Ramsey thinks of James as stark and uncompromising. I mean, he appeared the image of stark and uncompromising severity, with his high forehead and his fierce blue eyes. And I love it she's thinking that as she's watching him cut pictures out with scissors. He's cutting out a refrigerator. There are just those moments of such beautiful incongruity that strike me over and over again, from one sentence to the next in this novel.
Joellen?
I just have to comment. I just have to comment after Rebecca's note about there being no shadow of detachment and the level of commitment on Mr. Ramsey, who thinks that we're frail barks in the dark, foundering in the darkness. But nevertheless, Mr. Banks tells us of the moment of Mr. Ramsey's vision of a hen and chicks, and he commits to domesticity. And it's just so that there's certainly risk there. It isn't anything I would have thought of without that sentence, but thank you.
Any more discussion of risk taking?
Well, I was just thinking that Mr. Ramsey commits to domesticity, but, and this is looking forward when we get to the very next section, section 6. Now you see him wrestling with that commitment and with, with the pull in different directions. So even Mr. Ramsey, who's, when I'm not reading the novel, I'm thinking critically of Mr. Ramsey when I have distance from the novel. When I'm reading the novel, it's very, very different. I think the same with Odious Mr. Tansley. So I think that the characters, the way she complicates every character from moment to moment is just part of the real power of the novel. I wanted to ask about another sentence. One of the other things that Welty says that strikes me is that she says, we see that the novel too, from the start, is full of signals, many of them signals of danger. These take the form of questions in the characters' minds. And a passage that just intrigued me this time is in section 5 on page 27 of the version I'm looking at. This is Mrs. Ramsey. She says, and she's thinking about the house. You couldn't tell anymore that the house, that those were roses on it. Still, if every door in a house is left perpetually open and no lockmaker in the whole of Scotland can mend a bolt, things must spoil. Every door was left open. She listened. The drawing room door was open. The hall door was open. It sounded as if the bedroom doors were open. And certainly the window on the landing was open, for that she had opened herself. That windows should be open and doors shut, simple as it was, could none of them remember it? And I'm just intrigued by that idea of what should be open and what should be shut in the context of this novel. I don't know if anybody else noticed that passage or has some thoughts about it, but I found it intriguing in terms of this section of the novel being called The Window.
Beverly had a comment earlier, and I don't know if it's relevant here, but go ahead with your first comment, Beverly.
My comment had to do with the risk, and Mr. Banks was mentioned as well. And I thought he was thinking about Mr. Ramsey's risk. You know, he has 8 children. Not only how is he going to support them, but how is he going to educate them? And does Mrs. Ramsey have some money that will help educate them? So having 8 children would be a risk. You know, if you are thinking consciously of what their futures would look like and whether or not you could prepare them for those futures in a satisfactory way. So that brought that up in my mind when I read the section that Susan just mentioned with everything being opened. It just reminded me of something a mother would say, even if you're not looking at all the symbolism, that nobody shuts a door, nobody shuts a cabinet. If you had 8 children and a house full of people, I would be thinking the same thing all the time.
Cheryl and then Pearl.
I love I had actually highlighted that section in in Welty's forward, and tried to make a list of those questions to keep an eye on while I was reading the text, like, will the children ever get to the lighthouse? One thing that I found profound about Welty's essay is that it's as brilliantly beautiful as the writing of Virginia Woolf, similar to when we read Pride and Prejudice together and Welty wrote about the radiance of Jane Austen. It's like, I'm just applauding Welty for being her own artist, writing about such great work in her own great way.
Okay, Pearl.
First, to respond to Beverly's note, not only do they have the 8 children, which are the risk, but then Mrs. Ramsey invites all these other people that keep coming in and out. And so she helps find them other places to sleep, you know, and so she creates additional sort of chaos. But then to the humor part, there's this beautiful line that I marked. She could not help laughing herself sometimes. And so we know that she does have a sense of humor. She has to keep it to herself because she's trying to control the chaos. When Susan read the beautiful passage about the windows and the doors, that reminded me to go back and say, oh, this section is called The Window. Too often when there are chapter titles, I just rush right into the chapter and I forget to go, and I look back and say, oh, that was my key. I should have noticed that before. So it takes us back to what this whole section is called. And then 2 other questions that are asked in the sections we read today. On page 9, insoluble questions they were, it seemed to her, standing there holding James by the hand. He had followed her into the drawing room. I mean, so who knows, you know, the previous section was all these questions. And then over on page 24, how did it work out, all of this? How did one judge people, think of them? How did one add up this and that and conclude that it was liking one felt or disliking? And to those words, what meaning attached after all? Standing there now, apparently transfixed by the pear tree, impressions poured in upon her of those 2 men, and to follow her and so on and so forth. But you know, so Woolf is asking all these questions in different people's minds, and isn't that just the way we all are? You know, we think these questions, only occasionally are we brave enough or foolish enough maybe even to ask them.
I want to say one other thing about risk, and that is that Mr. Ramsey, of course, has risked his career by committing to domesticity. And there is that tension as well. Harriet, back to windows.
Okay, I'm going to stay with open and closed and with the passage that Pearl just read, because that was where I was going to. That is, I'm thinking about the way in which we're looking at perception and the way in which perception is both open and closed and then opens again. Getting from Lily's thought, how did we judge people, think of them? How did it add up to this and that, and conclude that it was liking the one felt or disliking. You know, as we watch a character, we watch each character thinking about others, making judgments, backing off from them, having different reactions, feeling different things at different moments about the same topic. For me, my favorite passage in this section of the novel is when Lily is running through all of her thoughts about Mr. Ramsey and thinks, all of this danced up and down like a company of gnats, each separate, but all marvelously controlled in an invisible elastic net, danced up and down in Lily's mind and in and about the branches of the pear tree, where still hung in effigy the scrubbed kitchen table, symbol of her profound respect for Mr. Ramsey's mind, until her thought, which had spun quicker and quicker, exploded of its own intensity. She felt released. A shot went off at a hand, and there came flying from its fragments, frightened, elusive, tumultuous, a flock of starlings. And then this flock of starlings is both the explosion of her thought and also the flock of starlings that Jasper has just routed with a gun. Beautiful, incredible passage, but also full of this sense of things being open and closed and the difficulty of knowing other people. And I have to say that that's the thing that I've decided I'm following now between Welty and Woolf, is the sense of the mystery of the other and the way in which we're looking at another writer who is who's a virtuoso on the topic of how we don't know and how we try to know.
Susan?
I'm sorry, I'm just reading in the chat. I liked this, the open doors and windows. This is from Melissa. In addition to avenues of seeing into this family, bring to mind exposure and erosion, the slow moving of time and its effects on the house and the family. And so I think that ties back to risk, doesn't it? That exposure is a risk. And over again, we have, I think, characters flirting with exposure. I mean, Lily and her painting, and wanting to keep it hidden. Mrs. Ramsey, even in her desire to protect James from disappointment, is, there's this sense that he's going to be exposed to a harshness in life that he doesn't have to be exposed to quite yet, or that she doesn't want him to be. So I think that's right. I think that so much of it does have to do with exposure. Sorry, I shouldn't be looking. Now I'm trying to read and talk at the same time. I can't do that. I'm curious, is anybody else reminded of Delta Wedding in the first section of this novel?
Cheryl?
That's not why I had my hand raised, because I have not read Delta Wedding yet. So I'll just put my hand down.
All right, we'll come back to you. Harriet.
Yeah, I'm just, I'm thinking about the house, the shabbiness of this house. I'm thinking about the correspondence between Mrs. Ramsey and Ellen, I'm thinking about the discussion of women's point of view versus men's, handled differently, maybe in the two works, but important in both of them.
And Rebecca?
Thinking about worry. And I think that I was so struck. I was reading Delta Wedding yesterday, and then I was reading this, and I kept thinking about the realization of here is Lily trying to paint Mrs. Ramsey, and the idea that as a mother, I'd also been asked by a student how one defines mother. And I thought, oh no, you know, like, whoa. So, but I thought that the fact that Mrs. Ramsey is never only in something we might call her individual thoughts or her own thoughts. She's always in her thoughts and her child's thoughts and her child's future and her future, and constantly, which Mr. Ramsey tries to pull back on, but does come into. But I really thought about that with Ellen, because so much of the way Ellen is functioning is in trying to find something of her own self, but there is this constant overlay of worrying about Dabney and what is that marriage going to be like, and is it going to be a failed marriage? And so there's a constant extension. And I was thinking of Eudora Welty Virginia Woolf in the Years, where she draws those points with ray stroking out at the top of the manuscript in the pargeters. And they're so profound because the idea of a self is not singular for Woolf. It is that point with ray stroking out, coming back. So that was, I may be at a high point of worry myself right now, and I'm just projecting, but I do think being a mother is that you have this constant dialogue with self about your child's future.
Oh, Marcia?
I didn't think I was going to be the first to say this, but I'm sure I'm not the first to think it. Ellen Fairchild has 8 children, and it cannot be an accident that Eudora Welty wrote Ellen Fairchild as a Mrs. Ramsey. To me, it's just absolutely clear. And Susan, I haven't read your book. I assume you talk about that.
I do, because I think there are real similarities there. And I don't want to take us off into a direction of talking about a novel that some people here haven't read. Though if you haven't read Delta Wedding, you really should read it the minute you're done with To the Lighthouse. Yes. Absolutely. But I think so. I had the funniest moment reading To the Lighthouse this time, and I realized, I thought 8 children, wait, I don't know 8 names. Who are these children? And I really spent a lot of time pouring through the novel this time, trying to figure out who all 8 were. I finally figured it out. Roger was the one I was missing. I had to find him.
I want to say one other thing, that it relates to this idea that the fact that there is no story or no, plot. You know who else was accused of that is Jane Austen with the novel Emma. And like Emma, this novel makes use of enormous free and direct discourse. You are so much in the mind of everyone. You always have, in any paragraph, any sentence, in fact, that you read, you have to think, now, that's not there's no objective narrator practically. There's, a few times there is an objective narrator telling you that something has happened, but mostly you learn everything from the mind of the individuals, and you have to figure out which mind am I in and who's thinking this, and from sentence to sentence. Sometimes you get a whole paragraph or a whole page, but not always. And to me, this is the joy of the modernist novel, that you don't need the style itself is exciting. I was so excited to read, and I just talk about preparation for this. I just finished Mrs. Dalloway, And there you are so much in everyone's mind and all these different characters. It's not just one like Emma. And it's just exciting in itself, even without plot. So just a thought.
Any other comments about Delta Wedding? Yeah, Joe Ellen.
Marcia's comment reminded me of two paragraphs that kind of slammed me in the face because they're narratorial commentary. At the bottom of page 28, when Mrs. Ramsey is distressed that her stocking for the lighthouse keeper's boy is too short, the paragraph begins toward the end of the page. Never did anyone look so sad. Bitter and black, halfway down in the darkness, in the shaft, which ran from the sunlight to the depths. Perhaps a tear formed, a tear fell. The water swayed this way and that, received it, and were at rest. And then she echoes, never did anybody look so sad. But then the next paragraph begins, but was it nothing but looks, people said? And that reminds me of, two things that struck me about Mrs. Ramsey, that when she's first thinking about going to the lighthouse, she looks around her living room for litter, which she would take with her, which doesn't seem exceedingly generous. But then also, it's Mr. Tansey who's with her when she visits the home of the sick woman or whoever was sick. And he sees her standing at the top of the stairs, and she changes the way she looks as though she had been pretending and she had now come back to herself. So that I really recognized there's a lot to keep track of here. But this is where the narrator or the commentator comes in. But was it nothing but looks, people said. So another of Pearl's questions for us to keep track of.
Susan?
I'm just trying to look at our time. I know we're getting short on time. Again, I'm still back to thinking about the novel being full of signals, many of them signals of danger. And before we're going to be moving on further into the novel, are there some other signals of danger that you've seen in the novel so far that we haven't really touched on yet, even though we've been talking about risk? Other signals that struck anyone?
Cheryl and Teresa.
Okay, so I'll be very quick. I agree with all of Joellen's points, particularly Mrs. Ramsey at the top of the stairs. Is she playing a part or a role? It's part of like, what is a woman's role? She feels very good about her charitable contributions to the neighborhood. And I feel like Mrs. Ramsey and James, that connection is going to be very important in light of a woman's and a mother's role. And then about Delta Wedding real quick, I don't know if it was Annette Trevster or who it was, but in the Welty Facebook thing asked something about Delta Wedding. And I remember I read a few of the first chapter, and everyone's so happy that they ignore the telephone ringing in the background. And at the time that book was written, having a telephone in the household was a big deal, but you were so happy to be with your family, you ignore that new technology to still just be with your family. And that's the end of my comment.
Teresa and then Harriet.
I think that we're going to get to the subject of time. This is under section 3, and I'm taking it slightly out of context. It says the ghostly roll of drums remorselessly beat the measure of life, made one think of the destruction of the island. And then it goes on, all was ephemeral as a rainbow. And then the last couple of words, the other sounds suddenly thundered hollow in her ears and made her look up with an impulse of terror. I think time's about to become important, but I don't know how. That struck me more than anything else.
And it also strikes me that you can't have a lighthouse without the sea and without the rolling, thunderous sound of those waves.
Harriet and then Pearl.
Thinking about danger, I'm just going back to the passage where James is thinking, had there been an axe handy, a poker, or any weapon that would have gashed a hole in his father's breast and killed him, then and there, James would have seized it. Such were the extremes of emotion Mr. Ramsay excited in his children's breasts. I think that the idea of parents' effects on their children is something that we're hovering over with a sense of danger. I'm thinking back to Rebecca's comment that maybe you should be asking about what does it mean to be a mother? Maybe we'll take that forward too.
Pearl?
One of the signals also comes with Lily Briscoe and her painting. On page 19, she's talking about her painting and says, then beneath the color there was the shape. She could see it all so clearly, so commandingly when she looked. It was when she took her brush in hand that the whole thing changed. So one of the signals is what we see, is that what is real? Is what is real, is that what we are able to see? What kind of change comes with the interaction among what's the reality and what our perceptions are.
Jessica?
Well, I'm just here to say it's time to close. Susan, are there any final comments before we wrap up today?
Well, I have so many comments that I can make right now that I'm sorry that this session is coming to an end, but I'm so pleased that we get to continue the conversation over the next number of weeks. I guess I was thinking I would just like to end by going back to, I think it's something that I think Cheryl said, but I might have lost track of who was talking about this, but Mrs. Ramsay and whether she is performing the kind of performative quality that you see when she changes. She seems to change. And I think one question that the novel asks is a question about what constitutes authenticity, what constitutes the real self. Are we more than just a series of different performances for different audiences, which I think Rebecca ties back to that spiral with the, being pulled in the different directions as well. So I think those questions about the self become increasingly more important as we go on into the next sections. And so I look forward to talking about those with you all.
Next week, we'll discuss sections 6 through 10 in the window. Bye-bye.
Thank you.